Nothing violent happened in this court. No laws were broken, no commands were written down, and yet, at the court of Charles II of England, power decided futures without ever raising its voice. Influence didn't come from orders. It came from access, being seen, being invited, being allowed near the king. This is not a story about scandal or excess. It's about a system where refusal wasn't illegal. It was unthinkable, and how an entire court learned the rules without anyone ever saying them out loud. When Charles II returned to the English throne in 1660, the country was exhausted. Years of civil war had taught people what open brutality looked like, and they did not want to see it again. Charles understood this perfectly. He did not rule like a tyrant. He ruled like someone people wanted to be near. He was informal. He spoke easily. He laughed with courtiers instead of intimidating them. And that changed how power operated. Because at Charles II's court, authority did not depend on commands. It depended on access. Access meant being allowed into the king's presence, to speak privately, to be seen, to be remembered. And access was never guaranteed. A single invitation could change a family's future. A single absence could quietly destroy it. Courtiers watched carefully who stood close to the king, who walked beside him, who was summoned, and who was kept waiting. No explanations were given, none were needed. If the king stopped acknowledging you, your influence faded. Your requests stalled. Your name stopped circulating. This was not punishment in the legal sense. It was something more effective: exclusion. Because in a court society, invisibility was fatal. Everyone understood this, especially those who depended on royal favor for income, protection, or advancement. Families rose and fell based not on merit alone, but on proximity. Young men learned how to place themselves physically and socially. Young women learned even faster. They learned when to lower their eyes, when to remain quiet, when presence was expected and when absence was safer. Refusal did not require enforcement. The system was already doing that work. And because this arrangement looked orderly, polite, structured, civilized, it did not register as coercion. It looked like tradition, but this quiet control created the conditions for everything that followed. Because once access becomes survival, power never needs to raise its voice. It only needs to open or close the door. Once access became currency, the next shift happened quietly. Charles II's private life stopped being private. This was not an accident, and it was not hidden. At his court, personal relationships were openly acknowledged and socially integrated. They were not whispered scandals. They were part of how influence moved. Charles II was married to Catherine of Braganza, the Queen. Her position was official, ceremonial, and visible. But the real dynamics of the court operated elsewhere. Favorites and intimate companions were granted proximity. That proximity created influence, and influence reshaped decisions far beyond personal matters. People seeking advancement learned a new rule. Power did not always flow through offices or councils. It flowed through private rooms. Who could speak to the king informally? Who could reach him without intermediaries? Who could shape his mood before policy was discussed? This mattered because court politics were not conducted only in public chambers. They were conducted in moments of leisure, conversation, and familiarity. And because these relationships were tolerated, sometimes even rewarded, there was no clear line to cross. Nothing had to be defended. Nothing had to be denied. Titles were granted, residences were assigned, children were acknowledged and provided for. This normalization removed accountability. When behavior is openly accepted, it stops being questioned. When it becomes routine, it stops being challenged. And so private life quietly became public power. Courtiers adjusted their behavior accordingly. They observed who had influence. They aligned themselves where advantage flowed. No one needed to ask whether this was appropriate. The court had already answered that question because the king's favor was visible, and favor was survival. What makes this unsettling is not excess, it is structure. There was no dramatic scandal to expose, no secret to reveal, no moment that demanded intervention. The system functioned smoothly because everyone understood the exchange. Closeness brought opportunity, distance brought risk. And because this arrangement operated in plain sight, no one could pretend they were unaware. Which leads to the question modern audiences struggle with most. If everyone could see this, why did no one resist? By this point, a modern viewer usually asks the same question. Why didn't anyone refuse? The problem is that refusal, in Charles II's court, was not a protected action. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't respected. It was dangerous. There were no written laws forcing obedience in these private dynamics. That made the system harder to confront, not easier, because consequences were not legal. They were social. To refuse someone powerful was to invite isolation, not dramatic punishment, quiet removal. Invitations stopped arriving. Requests went unanswered. Doors that once opened easily stayed closed. And in a court society, that silence carried weight. People depended on proximity to power for survival, not just individuals, entire families. A father's position could determine a daughter's marriage. A brother's access could determine a sister's future. Refusal by one person could ripple outward, harming everyone connected to them. So refusal was rarely framed as a moral choice. It was framed as irresponsibility. Young women at court were raised with this understanding long before they encountered power directly. They were taught how to behave, not how to object, how to comply gracefully, not how to resist openly. Silence was praised as maturity. Adaptation was praised as intelligence. And because no one was holding a weapon, no one called it coercion. The system relied on something far more effective than force. Expectation. Expectation that people knew their place. Expectation that they understood the cost of disruption. Expectation that maintaining order mattered more than individual discomfort. This is why so few moments appear in the historical record as open resistance. Not because people approved, but because resistance offered no clear outcome. Challenging power did not dismantle the system. It only removed the challenger from it. And once removed, their voice disappeared entirely. So people made calculations instead of declarations. They endured rather than confronted. They stayed silent because silence preserved options. This is the most uncomfortable truth of the court. Most people were not villains. They were participants, and the system succeeded precisely because it made participation feel rational. Which brings us to the final protection this structure had. Not fear, not secrecy, but respectability. By now, it might be tempting to see Charles II as a man hiding behind indulgence, but that would miss the most important protection he had, his reputation. Charles II of England was not remembered by his contemporaries as cruel or unstable. He was remembered as civilized. After years of revolution, regicide, and authoritarian rule, Charles represented relief. He was witty where others had been rigid, tolerant where others had been dogmatic, relaxed where others had ruled through fear. This mattered more than it seems, because public image shapes what people are willing to question. Charles supported the arts. He encouraged theater and music after years of suppression. He backed scientific inquiry and became a patron of what would become the Royal Society. He surrounded himself with thinkers, experimenters, and intellectuals. This created the impression of a modern, enlightened court. And that image acted as armor. When behavior raised discomfort, it was softened by comparison. At least he wasn't violent. At least he wasn't unstable. At least the country was at peace. Stability became the justification. People tolerated what unsettled them because the alternative felt worse. After chaos, order becomes persuasive, even when it carries a cost. This is how respectability protects systems. Criticism feels dangerous when it threatens something larger. Challenging personal behavior feels irresponsible when it risks political balance. Charles understood this instinctively. He did not present himself as untouchable. He presented himself as reasonable. And reasonableness is disarming. It convinces people that discomfort is manageable, that endurance is maturity, that silence is cooperation, not complicity. The court absorbed this logic. They told themselves that nothing here was extreme, that no one was being forced, that this was simply how power functioned. And because the king appeared cultured and benevolent, few were willing to interrogate the quieter costs of his authority. This is why image matters more than secrecy. Secrecy invites exposure. Respectability discourages it. And when power is wrapped in charm, intelligence, and calm authority, it becomes very difficult to name what is wrong, even when everyone feels it, which leads directly to the final, most unsettling realization of all. This is the point where the story refuses to give us an easy ending. Because when historians search for the moment where Charles II crossed a clear legal line, they don't find one. There is no decree ordering obedience, no written command demanding silence, no law explicitly broken in the patterns we've just seen. And that is precisely why no one stopped him. The court operated within tradition, hierarchy, custom. Power moved exactly where the system allowed it to move. That system had been shaped long before Charles II of England ever took the throne. He did not invent it. He stepped into it. And once inside, he understood how to use it. Nothing required secrecy, because nothing required defense. Behavior that follows accepted norms does not trigger intervention. That is the trap. When power functions legally, politely, and routinely, opposition becomes irrational. To challenge the king's private authority would have meant challenging the entire court structure, the social hierarchy, the distribution of favor, the idea that proximity to power was a legitimate currency. No single individual could do that safely, and so responsibility dissolved. Each person could tell themselves that the system was larger than them, that resistance would change nothing, that adaptation was wiser than confrontation. This is why history struggles with stories like this. We are comfortable condemning crimes. We are less comfortable confronting systems that operate exactly as designed, because systems don't look cruel from the inside. They look orderly, they look reasonable, they look normal. Charles II's court did not collapse because of excess. It endured because of restraint, because nothing here appeared extreme, nothing demanded outrage, nothing forced a reckoning. And that is what makes this story endure, not the man, not the gossip, but the realization that power does not always need to be violent to be absolute. Sometimes it only needs permission, and sometimes the most dangerous systems are the ones that never break the rules at all.